Hey, what's up, biology students? It's Mr. Holloway here, and today we're going to be learning some things about how the human body is organized in terms of cells, tissues, organs, and our various organ systems. And we're going to start learning about two particular organ systems that are pretty important to our health and well-being, namely the digestive system and the excretory system. Now, our body is organized into sort of four levels. Working from smallest to largest, we're made up of cells. Those cells make up tissues, those tissues make up organs, and those organs make up organ systems. Or we could think about it the other way around too, that organ systems are made of organs, organs are made up of tissues, and that tissues are made up of cells. Now, most of these things you've probably heard of before, and we've learned quite a bit about cells in particular this year, and I'm sure that in your previous science classes you've learned about organs and organ systems. But this thing called tissues may be a little bit new to you, although I'm sure that it's a term that you've heard of before. Tissues are groups of cells that work together and do similar jobs. So they all perform similar functions, and that's why they're able to work together in these things called tissues. And our bodies are made up of primarily four different kinds of tissues. Those are epithelial tissues. And epithelial tissues are important because they kind of protect us. They line the different surfaces of our body, both inside and out. Our bodies are also made up of muscle tissue, and muscle tissue is special because it's made up of these overlapping fibers that pull past one another in order to cause muscle contractions. And that's a unique property of muscle cells and muscle tissues. And there are several different kinds of muscle tissues that we'll learn about when we get to the muscular system. Our bodies are also made up of nervous tissue, and nervous tissue is special because it is able to send and transmit and receive electrical impulses that allows us to send signals rapidly through our body, and also allows us to be in contact with both our internal and external environment. And as we sense changes in those environments, our nervous system picks up on those changes, and our nervous tissue is able to send signals in the appropriate direction and to the appropriate place so that our body knows how to respond to those changes in our environment. And finally, our bodies are also made up of connective tissue, and connective tissue sort of just connects things. And there's a bunch of different examples that we see here on this page, including loose connective tissue that kind of makes up the padding, like below our skin, for example. Bone and cartilage are both made of connective tissue, cells embedded in this matrix of hard, or in the case of cartilage, kind of flexible extracellular material. And blood is a connective tissue. Blood, it just happens to be a connective tissue that's a bunch of cells floating around in a liquid matrix rather than being embedded in a solid matrix, as is the case with bone and cartilage. So those are our four different kinds of tissues, and remember, those are four vocabulary terms that you should know and be able to use as well: epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. And all of our organs and organ systems are made up of some combination of these four tissues. So the digestive system is the system that our bodies use in order to harvest useful materials from the food that we eat. And every time we eat something, the digestive system goes to work taking that food apart into its most basic pieces so that our body can absorb them and use them. So the important functions of the digestive system are as follows. 1, it breaks down food into basic molecules that can be used for nutrition and raw materials. 2, it helps eliminate waste left behind after nutrients have been absorbed from the food that we eat. And 3, it helps us to regulate our internal water balance by making sure to reabsorb as much water as we can from the food that we eat before it passes through us and we get rid of the leftovers. And the digestive process basically happens in 4 stages. And the first of these stages is ingestion, which is where we take in food through the mouth. The second of these stages is digestion, and digestion actually starts in the mouth and continues happening through the esophagus, but mostly digestion happens in the stomach. The next phase of the digestive system is absorption. And absorption is where we actually absorb nutrients from our food, and that occurs down in the small and large intestines. And the last phase of the digestive process is elimination. And elimination happens when we get rid of the stuff that our body just can't use. We eliminate it from the body. Now, as for the digestive part, the actual breaking down of the food that occurs so that our body can absorb and use those molecules and raw materials, our bodies make use of two kinds of digestion. Mechanical digestion, which is the physical breaking down of food by way of chewing and the churning that occurs in the stomach, and by way of chemical digestion, which breaks down food at a chemical level using enzymes and acids and things like that. Now, enzymes are very important to the digestive system, and we've talked a lot about enzymes this year. Remember, enzymes are proteins that do a very wide range of jobs in our body. In the digestive system, enzymes help us to break down complex macromolecules into simpler molecules that then our body can reassemble and use as needed. And in this animation, we can see the enzyme amylase going through and breaking the bonds in a complex carbohydrate, something like a starch. And by breaking those bonds, it's freeing up individual monomers called glucose that then our body can absorb and use as we produce energy in our mitochondria and things like that. But there's a lot of different kinds of enzymes that are important to the digestive process. And in this chart here, we can see a list of some of those enzymes. For example, we have in this column a list of enzymes including salivary amylase, pepsin, pancreatic amylase, trypsin, lipase, maltase, sucrase, lactase, and pepsidase. In this column, we can see where each one of those enzymes is active, or where we find it doing its job inside of the body. And then in this last column, we can see a little bit about what each one of those enzymes is responsible for. For example, salivary amylase, which goes to work on our food as soon as we put it in our mouth and start chewing it up, starts the process of breaking down complex carbohydrates into simpler carbohydrates. In the stomach, our food encounters an enzyme called pepsin, and pepsin helps us to start breaking down proteins into simpler polypeptides. Once we get to the small intestine, we find a bunch of enzymes that have been secreted by the pancreas, including pancreatic amylase, trypsin, and lipase, and these help us to continue the breakdown of starch and proteins, and lipase helps us to start breaking down lipids, or fats. Also in the small intestine, we find those enzymes maltase, sucrase, and lactase, and all of those are helping us to break down carbohydrates into smaller and smaller pieces until eventually we're left with glucose, a monosaccharide that our bodies use during cellular respiration to help us produce ATP. And we also find an enzyme called pepsidase, which helps us finish breaking down polypeptides into individual amino acids that then our body can reassemble to make the proteins that we need. Now, if you've ever wondered what keeps our food moving in only one direction through the digestive system, well, our system has a couple of different mechanisms to make that happen. So when you swallow something into the back of your throat, these muscle contractions called peristalsis push that chewed food down into your stomach. And we can see sort of an illustration of how this happens in the animation at the bottom of the screen. And these muscle contractions, called peristalsis again, ensure that our food is moving in the right direction and help us to keep food moving through the digestive system even if we're lying down or even standing on our heads. And this particular animation shows peristalsis occurring in the esophagus, but it actually happens throughout our digestive tract. It happens in the stomach to push food into the small intestine. It happens in the small intestine to keep pushing food through into the large intestine, and it happens in the large intestine to keep pushing the food and eventually the waste product right on out of our body. But our digestive system has these other structures called sphincters which aid in this process as well. So whenever food gets from one organ to the next organ, our digestive system has these ring-shaped muscles called sphincters that close off and prevent that food from going back in the opposite direction. So for example, once we've swallowed our food and once peristalsis has pushed it through our esophagus and down into our stomach, this sphincter called the esophageal sphincter closes off and prevents that food from coming back up into our esophagus and out of our stomach. Now, in our stomach, muscles will contract and it'll churn all of this food up, kind of like putting food in a blender, and they mush it up into this liquid called chyme. And because the stomach is producing a lot of stomach acids, it's important that this chyme doesn't squirt back up into our esophagus and burn us and cause indigestion and things like that. And that's what the esophageal sphincter is there to prevent. Once all of that chyme is really well processed and everything is really well broken down and we're ready to start absorbing nutrients, our stomach pushes that chyme out of the stomach and into the small intestine. And this other sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, closes behind it to prevent that chyme from coming back up into the stomach. Now, once that chyme has made its way into the small intestine, it's really, really liquidy at this point, and as it's moving through, it's passing over all of these circular folds. And these circular folds are important because they increase the surface area of the small intestine. Now, the small intestine already has a lot of surface area because we've got something like 20 plus feet of small intestine folded up inside of us. But then because inside of the small intestine we also have these folds that are lined with these finger-like projections called villi, further increasing the surface area of the inside of our small intestine. And if we zoom in on a single villus, we can see that it has these microvilli, which increase the surface area even more. Because of all of this surface area inside of our small intestine is really good at absorbing nutrients because there's a lot of surface area through which our small intestine can absorb all of that good stuff that we consume. So this is a really important example of the relationship between structure and function. Because of the structure of the small intestine, because it's a long tube that's all folded up, and on the inside of it it's all folded up again, and on those folds there are even more folds, and on those folds there are even more smaller folds, there is a ton of surface area inside of our small intestine for absorption to take place. And our small intestine would not nearly be as efficient at absorbing nutrients from our food if it was shorter or if it lacked these internal foldings. And in this diagram we can see that each one of these finger-like projections, each one of these villi, is filled with this capillary network, so that as food is, or rather as the chyme is passing over all of these folds, nutrients can diffuse from the outside into our bloodstream and then can get carried around the body where they need to go. And all of that surface area inside of our small intestine is what makes that possible. But our journey isn't quite over yet. Now that we've absorbed all of the good stuff from our food, we need to get rid of the leftovers, and we need to try to save as much of the water that's been introduced during this process as we can so that we don't dehydrate ourselves. And that chyme is a pretty liquidy stuff, and not to put too fine a point on it, but if you're healthy, the waste product that you're getting rid of at the end of the digestive process should not be a liquid. So that's where the large intestine comes into play. And the large intestine, the last leg of our journey through the digestive system, its primary job is to reabsorb as much water from that chyme as possible so that the only thing we're left with at the end is solid waste that then passes out of our body through the anus into the toilet and is gone. So the large intestine helps us reclaim as much water as we can so that we're not dehydrating ourselves every time that we go to the bathroom. And that's it. That's our trip through the digestive system. On this figure here we can see kind of an overview of the whole digestive system, starting in the mouth. When food is chewed, saliva starts digesting carbohydrates down into the esophagus, where muscles, in a process called peristalsis, push the food down into our stomach. In the stomach, everything is blended with digestive juices, and hydrochloric acid kills bacteria, while enzymes help us to start breaking down proteins. The liver and the pancreas produce a lot of enzymes and secrete this stuff called bile into our small intestine to aid in the process of digestion. And in the small intestine, food is mixed with bile from your liver and juices from your pancreas, and nutrients are absorbed from our food in the small intestine. In the large intestine, indigestible food and water are processed, and water is reabsorbed, and the solid waste passes out of us through the anus, and we are done with it. So that's the digestive system, start to finish. And it's a very important system because it's what allows us to get useful materials from our food. Now, the excretory system is mainly responsible for excreting metabolic waste produced by cells. It helps us to filter toxins from the bloodstream, and it helps us to regulate our internal water, salt, and mineral balance. Now, if you recall from the digestive system part of this video, the digestive system is also involved with eliminating waste from the body. But that's basically just the solid waste from our food that our body can't use. It can't even absorb that kind of stuff. But what happens with all the stuff that does get absorbed? All of those nutrients and molecules and raw materials absorbed in the small intestine, they get absorbed into our bloodstream. Our bloodstream carries them to the cells that need that stuff, and then our cells use them in a variety of metabolic processes. For example, our cells might use glucose as well as oxygen inside of our mitochondria to help produce ATP. And as a byproduct of that, CO2 is produced. And CO2 is a good example of metabolic waste produced by the cells. It's a waste product in the sense that our body can't use it, and it could become toxic if allowed to build up to high concentrations. And it's the job of the excretory system to get rid of that kind of metabolic waste. And one such metabolic waste that's particularly important for the excretory system to get rid of is this waste product called urea. And urea is basically nitrogenous waste from a variety of sources that, like a lot of things, gets toxic if it reaches high concentrations inside of our body. So the excretory system's job primarily is to help get rid of this nitrogenous waste with some other toxins in a process known as excretion, where we concentrate those toxins into a liquid that we call urine, and then we excrete that urine from the body. Now, the kidneys are the most well-known player in the excretory system, but there are some other lesser-known or lesser-acknowledged players that are important for us to mention as well, and those include the skin, the liver, and the lungs. And each one of these three organs can be said to be part of the excretory system because they're all involved with excreting metabolic waste products. For example, a little bit of urea as well as some salt and some water is excreted through our skin when we sweat. The liver helps us gather up all of those nitrogenous waste products and creates this urea stuff that then our kidneys filter out and get rid of. And the lungs are where we get rid of the metabolic waste from cellular respiration. So as cellular respiration is occurring inside of our mitochondria, ATP is being produced, but CO2 is also being produced. And the lungs help us get rid of that CO2 before it reaches toxic levels. But really the most important organ in the excretory system is the kidney and the associated structures that go along with it. And here in this diagram we can see one where we find the kidney in the body, and then zooming in we can see this really important structure inside of the kidney called the nephron. And the nephron is where a lot of the filtering and reabsorbing and things like that take place. And there's basically three steps to this process. First step is filtration, where blood enters a nephron through a capillary. And these capillaries form a ball inside of the glomerulus. From the glomerulus, filtrate flows into a tubule, or a very small tube, and blood cells and large substances remain in the capillary. So we've filtered the blood by getting rid of a lot of water and salts and other things like urea and whatnot, and all of that is gathered inside of these tubules. So step 2 is reabsorption. And as this filtrate, as this stuff that we've removed from the blood moves through the tubule, water and many other substances that are important to the body are reabsorbed through the capillary walls into the blood. So that filtrate is collected in this place called Bowman's capsule, where then it is funneled into these tubes, and as it passes through these tubes, our body reabsorbs as much of the good stuff as we can so that we're left with only the waste products in the filtrate or in the urine that then we will excrete later, which is actually the last phase of this process, urine excretion. So once water and other important substances are reclaimed by the blood, the filtrate, which is called urine, gathers in these collecting ducts and is transported through these tubes called ureters to the urinary bladder. And the urinary bladder is a place where we can sort of store that urine until a convenient time where we can excrete it from the body and be done with it. Now, sounds pretty simple, right? But there's a lot of complex stuff happening in this process. And we're going to zoom in a little bit closer on this structure here that we call the nephron. And we're going to see if we can't make some sense of what's going on here. So, blood comes into the nephron through these capillaries here. And this ball of capillaries is what we call the glomerulus. Now, the glomerulus sort of pushes out this filtrate, and that filtrate is gathered in this thing that we call Bowman's capsule. And blood cells and big molecules and stuff like that are left behind in the capillaries so that they can get recirculated. But all of this liquid and salts and urea and stuff like that we call filtrate then gets funneled through this system of small tubes. Those are the tubules that we were talking about. And then it goes through this loop. And this is a pretty important loop here, and it has a name. This is the loop of Henle. And we should notice that this loop of Henle is surrounded by this network of capillaries. Now the thing about this loop is that on the downward journey here, the environment that's surrounding that loop is getting saltier and saltier, and this part of the loop is only permeable to water. So as we learned about before, when you've got a difference in concentration on either side of a membrane, things are going to sort of balance each other out as substances diffuse across that membrane. But because this part of the loop is only permeable to water and not to salt, as we go into a saltier and saltier environment, water is going to be diffusing out of this tube, where then it can diffuse into the capillaries and be recirculated around our body so that we're not losing too much water. Now that's all well and good, but on the other side of this loop, things change a little bit. So as this filtrate goes up through this part of the loop of Henle, the environment is getting less and less salty as we go up. However, this part of the loop is not permeable to water. This part of the loop is permeable to salts. So in order to balance out that concentration as the filtrate is coming back up in this direction, certain salts like sodium chloride, or rather the ions that make it up, sodium and chlorine ions, diffuse back out into the kidney environment here. This process continues to happen over and over and over again. So we're reclaiming as much water as we can and reclaiming some salts and some minerals and blood sugar and things like that we need so that the waste products, the urea, get concentrated in these tubes and then eventually get collected in these even bigger tubes from a lot of different nephrons throughout our kidney, and these tubes lead to the ureters and eventually to the urinary bladder so that we can excrete these waste products. And that's the role of the excretory system. Now, it's a very important function, and it works in conjunction with the digestive system because both of these are responsible for helping us take in things that our body needs, nutrients and molecules and things like that, and getting rid of the waste products so that those waste products don't toxify our internal system. And in that way, they're helping us to maintain homeostasis, or a balance within our internal environment. The digestive system, for example, helps to supply the body with needed materials and molecules. It helps to eliminate solid waste while reabsorbing water. And in fact, some of the heat that's released as a result of metabolism helps us to maintain our internal temperature. So as we're burning calories, literally, heat is being released into our body that keeps us warm and keeps our body within that comfortable temperature range. The excretory system helps filter out toxins and metabolic waste from the bloodstream after all that good stuff is absorbed by the digestive system and after our cells process it and break stuff down and build other stuff up and give us energy. Our cells are producing some waste products as well, and the excretory system helps us to get rid of those waste products while also maintaining our internal salt, blood sugar, and water balance by reabsorbing a lot of the good stuff that would be lost without that fancy structure that we call the nephron. So those are our big picture themes for today. Hopefully you learned a lot. Don't be afraid to go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure that you learn the concepts. And we'll talk about some more of this stuff when I see you next time in class.